All right, good morning, everybody. I hope it's working today. It looks like it is. Excellent. Let me get to where I can see the comments, and then I'll get started. So give me just a second because my screen decided to be a brat. All right, good morning. My name is Samantha Mirabal. I'm with Melco's application team, and this is our Design Shop Talk where we try to get together every week to answer whatever questions you might have. You can always email them in to applications@melco.com. If you have them while we're live, type them in on the comments section for where you're watching this. I know Scott, I believe, is at Melco watching this. I'm down in Florida doing it. So let's go through the questions, and if you have any others, please feel free to type them in. All right, and we'll try to fit those in as we go. So for this week, these are some that were sent in, either typed on when we ask questions or other. Can you review the splice overlap setting after splicing an object? I tried different settings, but I really just don't see an effect. Okay, so let's look at that. Oops, I didn't start DesignShop. So let's start DesignShop. And I actually made a little just an example. It's really simple, and if you want to see how to digitize it, I guess I can do that too. But before I get distracted, and let's look specifically at that. So first, if you don't know what a splice is, this is a splice. So this is a complex fill, and a splice is where anytime your stitches go over that line, it's going to add a needle penetration there, so you can add some definition to your shape. As you see here, this is a straight splice through there. Areas you would use it, imagine if this were an H. You might want your stitch direction on this middle going up and down, and on the bars you would want it going side to side. So what do we do about that? So what is the splice overlap? Well, that's where, when you go here, if there's going to be an overlap between these two sections. So if you go into your properties, so you'd select whatever shape it is, double click on it, and under Advanced you'll see right here is a splice overlap. And so that's literally how far is this going to overlap. So if I change this to something big, I wouldn't suggest 50, but just so you can see it. Now I've got 50 points of overlap between the center and that side bar. And I can go measure it here and you'll see that's where my 50 points is going. Okay. Now, if you're not seeing it, so let's look at here. I've got a single splice in there. I've got one stitch direction. So when I go into this one and I do the same thing, 50, well, look, it looks the same. And that's because it's one stitch direction. Now, if I take that same shape and give each area a different, good morning, Edith, and give each one a different stitch direction. So, this top half, the stitches are running this way, the bottom, they're going this. It doesn't have to be 90, it just needs to be different. Now, when I go into those properties and go to my overlap, and again, I'm going to do something silly, 50. All right, that's not good, but you get the idea. Just to show you, we're getting a large overlap there. So, you'd want to do something more reasonable, 3 to 7, or, something smaller. Okay, and that is actually overlapping those sections there. So you can see now my stitches are going past the line. Okay, so that's your splice overlap. Okay, so if you're not seeing it, it could be you just have a single stitch direction and you need to add different stitch directions to be able to actually see what that is doing. All right, can I go over the auto tie button? What's the best way to jump from small objects, multiple parts like a star, instead of having a trim for each and everything? So I haven't, so Scott recently, I think just this week, did a video on digitizing practices and how to clean some things up. So where he goes over kind of the pathing in there. I haven't watched it quite yet. He was telling me about it, but that's tomorrow's task. This week's been crazy. So, but you can watch that to get an idea. But let's talk about the auto tie, or the tie-in, tie-off, why they're important. Where is DesignShop? There you go. All right, so first off, what are we talking about? So if you, again, select whatever element you want. I usually find it easier. Oops, there we go. Let's look at text. Okay. So if I go into the properties, again, to get to the properties, select the element, double click on it, right click on it. There's lots of ways to get to the exact same place. Right here, tie in and tie off. All right, so what are these? All right, the tie-in are the set of stitches that's made right when your machine starts. Okay, so after trim, you know, it's the top thread is no longer connected to your bobbin thread, so you don't want to just stab into the fabric and start sewing, because that's when you just drag thread along. What you want to do is lock that top thread and bottom thread together so that you have a nice starting stitch. So the tie-in, so there's someone else. This was just typed in, so I'm having a difficult time doing an arc down a curve. For text? Okay, come back to that. Let's keep talking here. All right, so for our tie-ins, the tie-in are the stitches made at the beginning. Your tie-offs are the stitches that are made right before a trim or at the end of an element, okay, before it moves to the next thing. The only when necessary is where it's going to look at your auto properties to decide when it needs to trim. All right. So when you have it set to 64, so this is an auto trim, so that's how far of a thread are you going to leave before, you know, you're just going to drag from element to element before you trim it. The default is 64. So let's look at that. It's easiest to show with text, which is why I did that. If I move my text all really close to each other, all right, that one's not going to do it because of where the start is. I'll move the start. There we go. So let's say this is what I have, and I don't like it. My starts and stops, I'm just trying to force the jump stitches in there. All right, I have a few. So why are those connectors there? That's because where one element ends, which is where the red X is, to where the next element starts, that if that number from that point to there is smaller than whatever you have in the auto trim, it's going to leave the connector stitch and keep sewing. All right. If, on the other hand, it's larger than whatever that number is, it'll trim it out, insert a tie stitch for the tie off. Okay, so right there's the tie off, and then it will go over to the next one. So sorry, that's the trim, auto trim, and then over here it'll do a tie stitch. Well, if those are closer and it's going to connect them, so right there's the tie off that exists now. Well, if I put this over, notice it goes away. All right, so it's just going to do a needle penetration jump to the next. All right, so that is what this only when necessary. All right, so if you're wanting to be able to trim these tails out after the fact, all right, so let's say you want to leave all the connectors in to get, you know, have the machine sewing at a higher speed later, and you just want to trim them out with your little scissors later. That's not my favorite task, but you can change that to always, and that way it'll put a knot there, and it'll, depending on what this number is, it'll leave the connector stitch so that later you can go trim it out without risk of this letter coming unraveled. All right. Now, when you're looking at, your specific example was like parts of a star, okay, instead of a trim. So let's say you're doing the top half of the star, you do a column stitch, and then you walk down to another spot and do a column stitch. What you want to do is pay attention to your starts and stops, and always make sure your next element is starting wherever you previously ended. So with text, like I said, it's just easy to show it, but let's look at that. So let's look at Scott's stars. His stars are fantastic. Where are they? Common symbols, like this guy. Okay, so if we just look at the auto shape, you know, we've got a bunch of running stitches. We do a column stitch. Now, if you look at where it starts and stops, and then the next element starts, it starts near there. So by setting these to all as necessary and having that jump, that stitch larger, everything will keep sewing without adding those little tie-offs between every element, which just adds extra stitches that aren't needed. Okay, so you know, there's reasons to have it set higher, there's reasons to have it set smaller. It really depends on what you're digitizing. Okay, so that auto trim down here, the larger it is, the longer of a jump stitch it will leave, or connector stitch it will leave between elements. If you want, you know, between text, if you want to keep those trimming between all the letters or through most smaller letters, then you would choose it to be like 20 points, maybe 20 to 30 points. Okay. Is the always then applied to everything in your design or just the element you chose? So always would be just the element you have selected. If you want it to apply to everything, you would have to select everything and do that, or have your properties set up that way first before you start digitizing. Okay, so if I just go in here and go to the properties and change my tie-offs to always, which I wouldn't do for this one, but if I did that, that only applies to this individual element, not to anything else. So to make it apply to everything, I would have to select everything. Now, it's different for text. Okay. For text, you can say always, and that will apply to every letter. Okay. What would be the lowest you would recommend on the auto trim? Well, that's kind of, it's a personal preference. I think if letters are, this is just personal opinion, if letters are close enough together, let's say you're doing tiny text, right? You don't really want to trim between every element because you're hardly moving any real distance between the elements. So by tying off and tying in between every little letter when you're really small, you're actually going to create more problems. You're going to make the runtime longer. It's just not a good idea, right? So I like setting this to somewhere between 20 and 30. That's just what I find works. 64 points is about 1/4 of an inch, okay? So 1/4 of an inch between letters, between elements, kind of long. 20, I find, looks good to me. So most people don't notice those connectors when they're that small, when they're smaller than 20 points. Now, you'll always have those clients who go, I don't like any of those, I want them all gone. Okay, well, then you can reduce that down. But, you know, to me, 20 to 30 is a good number. So what I would suggest is play with it a little bit. You know, take one, if you're doing it, if you're concerned with text, take one word, try a different setting, sew them out and see what you like. You might find that you're okay with 35-point connectors where I only like 20 points. You know, it's really, it's, what do you end up liking? Okay. All right. Let's see. What other questions do we have? Hi. I'm glad to see you here. Okay. So we talked about the splice, the auto ties. Can we go over split element? Okay. So split element is fun. So, oh, I already have. While you can you explain the auto tie? So auto ties are, so the tie, remember, is the same here. So you have tie in and trim. So auto tie is your tie in. So the same thing it does for the trim, it decides whether you're going to do a tie in or tie off based on a number. So if I turn on auto tie, that is going to decide based on this length after a trim if it's going to do a tie in or tie off or not. Okay, so let's say you auto tie, you have this set to a big number, it does a trim, or it doesn't do a trim, it's not going to do an auto tie stitch depending here. I would suggest leaving that off and having the auto trim decide when you do a trim or not, or maybe set to always if you always want to have tie-ins and tie-offs. Okay, so it really depends on what you want. Only when necessary is generally good for most applications, as long as you're not going to trim out all your little connector stitches everywhere. So just think about your use case to what makes sense for you. Okay. All right. What was the question again? Oh, split element. Okay. So let's look at, I have an element with a splice in it. So let's say I have a shape here. I've got a splice. I'm going to make it a different shape so you can see the difference. So you can see it's actually splicing. Okay, or it's cutting along the splice. So split element is where you want to take any element and cut it into 2 pieces. Okay, it is a level dependent feature, so all levels don't have this. But let's say I want to split this down that splice line that I have. I would select the end point of 1, hold my control key down, and select the end point. So now that I have it selected, over here, I can come to split the element at the selected point. And you'll see, I'll just recolor it so you can see what it did. Now I've got 2 separate shapes that split along that line. So that splits this complex fill along a splice. Now split element works for other things too. So let's say I've got a line that I've drawn, okay? And I want this to be 2 lines and not 1. For whatever reason, I want this straight line separated. So I can select the shape, select the point that I want to split it at, and say split the element at selected point. And now, rather than that being one shape, I now have 2 individual shapes that I can play with. Okay, so that I didn't have to select multiple points because it's just a straight line. You know, it also works with your single line center. So if I draw whatever shape I want using my left clicks and right clicks, yeah, let's just draw that. Enter, enter to accept the default width. And again, let's say right there is where I want to split that element. I would select the point. Ben, I have that up as a question. All right, so I select a point here and split element at selected point. Okay, so I've got these separated into now 2 elements. All right, so that's your split your element. So with your complex fill, you just have a little bit more options with it because you can split along a split line. If you had multiple points, you can select those 2 points and say split element, and it will split it at that. You do lose your splices on if you have a whole bunch of splices on a complex fill. Whatever one you split across, you'll lose the rest. So just be aware of that. Okay, so that was our split element. Did that help? I hope it did. All right. Will we ever be able to save the thread chart with a design instead of entering the threads each time? You currently can do that. Okay, so let me explain how I'm understanding this. I'll tell it to you a few different ways just because. So I think what this question's asking is, you know, if I load, let's say I've got a 8-color design, whatever it is, and I'm using needles 2, 7, whatever, pick numbers on your thread chart. So in your OS, you're setting up colors and you pick randomly around here, right? And you're going to run this same design at a later point. You don't want to have to go recolor it all. Well, from the OS, so from MOS, you can go File, Save, and save it off to your desktop or whatever. A good example of why you would want to do this, let's say you're, Scott describes it as boss mode, right? So let's say you're in the middle of running a 50 shirt order. You've got a complex design that's got 10 colors, and you're only 10 shirts into it, and they say, hey, they come in and say, just stop what you're doing. Here's something I need to run you interrupt whatever you're doing, run this one thing, and then go back to what you were doing. Because we got a hot client sitting out here that wants this item done immediately. Okay, so you have to break down, you set up your new design, you run it, now you've got to come back and reload it. Well, if from OS you go File, Save, and save it, when you reload the file, so File, Load Design, go find the one that you saved the settings on. Right here, you can load machine settings, and it will reload all your colors for you that were previously selected. So that right there will reset your colors. If you have any color by settings, any of that, it'll load all the machine settings back for you. Okay, so that's one way you can do that. Another is within DesignShop. So let's say you have a design, go back to DesignShop. Let's go get a design we all open up all the time that everyone wants to know why. All right, so let's say I've got a design and I'm going to use polyneon thread. So I come over here and I color it with the exact colors I intend to use. Okay, oops. So I come and find my color chart. I come over here and say, all right, I'm going to make the pears this lemon tart color, 1924. I'm going to make, if you use the simple form, can we do that, saving the colors? I'm pretty sure you can. I would have to look up the info for you. I don't do it, I can't remember where the button would be. I'll look it up and I'll type it in after this. I don't have a machine hooked to here, otherwise I just switch it. All right. So, Jeanette, I'll get back to you on that unless Scott gets to it before I do. All right, so 1902, let's say the bird, I want to be color, I don't know, salmon. This is really getting ugly, but whatever, you get the idea. Let's say I'm going to use black outlines, 1800. All right, there we go. Okay, so if I save this with the actual colors I intend to use, all right, so I come up here, File, Save, and save it as an OFM. All right, I'm going to save it as a different one because I don't want to overwrite this file. Okay, so now when I go to OS and I do Load Design, so File, Load Design, I load it. I can actually tell the machine to auto color the design for me, so I don't have to go choose it all. So let's say, but to use that feature, you have to color your thread tree. Okay, so your thread tree can't be gray like this. It has to be colored, and when I use auto, the auto coloring process, I actually color all these. So how you would do that is, you know, click on your color sequence. When you get that up on your tree, you would right click on each of these bubbles. And when you right click on it, it will bring this up. You'd go find whatever color it is you have on that particular needle. And you would assign all the colors. All right. After that's assigned, okay, we go out of this, you know, close that box. Oops. You're left with this one. Now you've got to tell it to auto assign the colors. So what you do there is right here where it says design colors, if you change that to active colors, down here a box will appear that says auto match. So you can tell it to only do exact matches. So if whatever you have in the OFM file is actually loaded on the machine. Okay, so if you do that, you say auto match, and it'll find whatever colors the numbers were saved in the OFM, it'll match it. If you have an exact match selected and there's not an exact match, it'll come up with a little pop-up box telling you to assign that color, and you'll have to choose whatever needle you're going to run that color on. Okay. If you don't have exact match and you just say auto match, it'll use the RGBs and just get as close as possible to whatever that was in the OFM based on what you have loaded on the machine. Okay. Oh, Jeanette Scott answered for me. Saving needle number assignments is not possible with the simplified interface, with the user interface, so you would have to use the advanced interface to do that. Okay. But Scott, is in the simplified interface, can they use auto match? All right. So let's see. Anyway, so that is another way you could do it. So you can either file, save off, and then save the file from OS, and then use this button here to load machine settings. Okay. All right. Are there any tutorials about how to get the most out of my DesignShop Lite? Okay, so DesignShop. Is there auto match color in DesignShop for the digitizing colors? Yes, there is. That's on the color palette. You can right click and tell it to match colors. All right, sorry, let me just show you. All right, so let me close this mess. Let's open up that file again, the original. So these are ARC colors. So if I right click and go to on the color palette here, edit color, and choose whatever chart I want, I can say match chart, and it will match as close as possible to the RGB values that were there. And now you'll see it actually assigns from the color chart that I had selected whatever is closest to those. Okay. Oh, how to get the most out of DesignShop Lite. So let me show you where to find that. Oh, good, it's working. So if you go to Melco University. Okay, over here, media. So in DesignShop Lite, you don't have any of the digitizing. All right, so you're not going to be able to do any of those. But you can start from here and work your way down through editing, and you can do most everything that's covered in those videos. And that will go through all the different properties you can, the basic editing, how to do lettering, how to make your lettering look nice. But I would start at the top here and work through all the videos. Nate did a great job with these, and you can learn a lot of what you have available to you, what the different properties do for you. You know, these are all on YouTube as well. I just like this because they're all in order, you know, in watch order. They probably are on the YouTube channel as well. It's just easy to find here. Okay. So that's what I would suggest. Now, DesignShop Lite, you're not going to have any of the digitizing tools, so you can kind of just disregard these down here. Okay. When using auto-digitizing to convert SVGs to stitches, are there any way to use it to create a walk stitch or bean, not just to go to a complex fill? Yeah. Okay. Close. No. Close. No. All right. I'm going to go open an SVG. I brought one over. Of course, changed my file locations, and I got to go find it again. Give me a second. Sorry. So I've got an SVG I bought from, I don't remember where, I have it saved off where I bought it from, but anyway, so I've got an SVG, and if I just go and convert it to stitches, it does it as a complex fill. Okay, so that's not what we want. We don't want it to be a complex fill. We want it to be a bean stitch. All right, so select the vector, hold the let's do shift. So hold the shift key and click on walk input method, which is that button right there. So now what you'll see, if I turn off the vector, now I've got a walk stitch. See, walk normal. Okay, so you don't use this button up here, the convert to embroidery. You have to select the vector and then convert it to your walk element with shift or control. Control will get rid of your vector though, so shift is better. Another way you can do, let's see, another thing you can also do with that is rather than holding your shift key, you can select the vector and then come over here to this one, change element from one type to another. Okay, this, rather than having to know to shift, what you would do is decide, all right, I want this shape to go from a vector, which was my SVG that I opened, to a bean stitch. Do I want to get rid of the vector? If I do, I'd hit replace. If I just want to leave the art there, I can say add. And now, if I turn off the vector, you'll see I've got a bean stitch. All right, so that's the easiest way, is to select your SVG that you want to convert over and then turn it into there. Can you auto-match thread from art prior to digitizing? You've got to know the RGB numbers. So you'd have, trying to think how you do that. I mean, you can auto-convert it over. From your auto-convert, it'll assign RGB numbers, and then you can auto-match it to whatever thread chart you want. So similar to what I just showed over here, right-click, edit color, choose the chart, and say match chart. Hit apply, so that'll match it. So if you do a convert over, it'll use RGB values, and then you can tell it to match to whatever chart, and it will get close to whatever the closest RGB number is there. Okay. Okay, let's see. Did I answer all that? I think so. Yeah, a walk stitch or bean. All right, how do I fix this? So I wasn't sure, I didn't see this file sent in for us to look at. Overall, I know Scott recently did this this week to go over digitizing practices, but when this looks like a TrueType font to me, when you're using your TrueType fonts, sometimes they work great, sometimes not so great, and you have to modify either the underlay properties or the wireframe, maybe add splices, other things. If you have the file, if you can send it over to applications at Melco.com, we'll look at it and give you specifics, but if I had to guess, it's probably a combo between the underlay properties not being quite right, and then you can see where it's sweeping around. You can clean that up with splices and changing your stitch directions and things like that, but it would be helpful if we had the file to be able to look at. Okay. Rotating using F never works. It kicks me out of OS. I don't have that issue. I use that a lot. So what I would suggest for you is call Melco, the service department, and they can log into your computer and do it with you, and they can either fix it for you or help get it to the right team in engineering if necessary to figure out what's going on. All right. And again, same with the loading from a design queue. I always load them all to the design queue and just click load file and they load. So if you have specific examples, send them in and let us look at them, or call into service department and show them so they can see exactly what's going on, to see if it's a step that's missing or if there's actually a bug. All right. Last question, Ben. I know you asked this, and I know several people have asked this. How do we do photos similar to this lovely one here? All right. So doing photos really boils down to a lot of work. So what you want to think about your picture is kind of like a paint by number, right? So because you can't have a whole bunch of colors to form the blend, but you would need to think of each element kind of blocked into different colors so that you can digitize each of those sections differently and get around your picture that way. It really is thinking about the colors, and the easiest way to imagine it is paint by number. So if you can boil down your artwork into something that looks closer to those color blocks, then digitizing it becomes simple. Simple is relative, I guess, but it becomes a lot easier, right? Because you can have those few colors and then work on the blends between there using random edges, or two colors, and then to get a blend across there, add a third. You have to play with the different stitch lengths and things like that. I did talk to Scott and some of the others just before this class. Right now, all of us are slammed trying to get other things done. Yeah. So the real answer to digitizing this would be to actually block out the artwork ahead of time into the different color blocks and then manually digitize it. Okay, that would be the best way to do it. We're going to work on putting an actual class just to explain it together. It's going to take a little bit of prep work to actually break it down because it's a bit of art to it. Okay, so there's no auto convert that just smash over. Here's a picture. You actually need to kind of spend time thinking about it, working on the artwork and whatnot. But like I said, if you can find either an app or something that will convert the art over into color blocks, it makes it a lot easier to go through and create the actual photo digitizing from there. Okay, it's still just a lot of thinking about it, correctly choosing your colors. I mean, when you think about different skin tones and the blends, natural light and actually seeing the colors in front of you help you pick them out. I've seen some pretty amazing ones that are like Michael. Yeah. Can you take it? You can take it into a photo editing program and posterize it. Yes. So if you posterize it, and again, that's kind of creating it, making it look like a paint by number, if you will, then you can take that over and bring that kind of modified artwork over and start digitizing it and adding the reality by changing your stitch lengths and things like that. I know when it comes to blending, Nate did a video a while back about blends. Then there's an article on the Milko blog that was also covering that. Okay. Yeah, I've been trying. Yeah. Okay. What else? All right. So those are all the questions that I had sent in. Anything else? Yeah, it's hard to figure out how many layers when you're doing that. It is. I mean, photos are really turn into an art of trying to figure out kind of that best, not having too many colors, because you start putting so many things on one, it's not going to sew well, or you're going to have so many colors that you're not really getting the blend effect you want. Okay, but I've seen this question asked a few times by different people, so it's moving up our list of things we're going to prep as soon as we get time. So we'll try to figure that out, putting like a Wednesday class together for you on that. Okay, at least working through an example so you can see how it works. It would be nice, a color separate. Oh, yeah, I would like that. So it'd be nice to have a color separation specialty made, or especially made for embroidery. That would be cool. I don't know. Have to add that to our list of things to ponder. All right. Are there any other questions? Okay. I don't don't see any typed in on my other monitor over there. That's what I keep on looking at. So remember, be sure to send in your questions to us. Type them in, add them to this, and we'll try to add them to next week's. Send them into applications@melco.com, and we'll get them answered, or at least add them to our feature list if it's something that's kind of outside of being able to cover here. All right. If there's no other questions, I don't see any typed in, then I will call it a day and talk to you guys next week. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.